Good morning. I'm Evan Donovan. News Channel 8 is your local election headquarters, and this is Politics on Your Side. Lots to get to today, folks. The Florida legislature began its 2020 session on Tuesday, and we speak with Hillsborough County Public Defender Julie Holt about her future plans and some new information on the murder trial for the accused Seminole Heights serial killer. But we begin this morning with Amendment 4. On Thursday, the Florida Supreme Court delivered its long-awaited answer to the question Governor Ron DeSantis asked it last year. Does the phrase "all terms of sentence" in Amendment 4 include fines, fees, and restitution? The court's ruling was clear. Yes, it does. And its reasoning relied primarily on the fact that the sponsors of Amendment 4 specifically said it did multiple times. When sponsors wrote their brief to the state Supreme Court trying to get Amendment 4 on the ballot, they said people with felony convictions other than murderers or sex offenders, quote, will automatically regain their right to vote upon fulfillment of all obligations imposed under their criminal sentence. When they argued in front of the court, Justice Polston asked whether all terms included full payment of any fines. They said yes, all terms means all terms within the four corners of the sentencing document. The ACLU said on its website and in its voter guide in 2018 that Amendment 4, quote, included any probation, parole, fines, or restitution. The ACU and other sponsors said the same thing in a letter to the state about how to implement Amendment 4 in mid-December of 2018, a full month after it was approved by voters. That letter said, quote, the phrase completion of all terms of sentence includes any period of incarceration, probation, parole, and financial obligations, which may include restitution and fines imposed as part of a sentence or a condition of probation. The ACLU and those groups are now part of a federal lawsuit challenging the law that was enacted by the legislature to administer Amendment 4. They argue the new law violates the U.S. Constitution, effectively creating a poll tax. U.S. District Court Judge Robert Hinkle ruled in October that people who can't pay those costs can't be restricted from voting. We spoke to Tampa State Representative Jamie Grant, who chairs the legislature's Criminal Justice Subcommittee. He was happy about the state Supreme Court's ruling this week, but Hinkle's ruling, he says, is wrong.
What he has created is a system that says you only have to pay restitution if you can afford. And I just don't think a two-tier system of justice is the way that things should work. We created the waiver process on purpose, which would allow the payee to come in and say that they are going to waive payment, and that would serve as a pathway for people who may not be able to afford. We created the community service pathway for people who wanted to earn that may not be able to pay, that want to earn credit for those dollars by doing community service. We created a lot of different pathways for people, but at the end of the day, you have some people who want to treat victims like criminals and criminals like victims. And that's not going to be the posture of the Florida House or certainly our Criminal Justice Subcommittee. But our subcommittee will continue doing what we've always done to try and provide greater access to justice and a more equitable criminal justice system.
And Judge Hinkle has said that, you know, if you don't fix it, it's a possibility he'd throw the amendment out as unconstitutional as a poll tax. Mm-hmm. Cynics would say there's no incentive for the legislators who don't like Amendment 4 to do anything, because then the judge would get rid of it.
Yeah, I think there's two things. I have not had a single person tell me they don't like Amendment 4. I've had conversations with colleagues of mine who say that we would have done it differently. I'm one. I would have created greater restoration for a smaller pathway of people. When I say a smaller pathway of people, one of the things that is a misnomer that people don't realize with Amendment 4 is that the message was this is a nonviolent population. That's just fundamentally false. Attempted murderers, violent habitual felony offenders are covered by Amendment 4. It's not easy to become designated as a violent habitual felony offender. These are people that are real dangers to the public. And so that limited our ability to provide full restoration last year. We've been spending the offseason working on that. But I don't know anybody that doesn't like or has a problem with Amendment 4, number one. But I think Judge Hinkle's bigger problem is created by the ACLU's patent lies and disingenuous litigation, right? The ACLU obviously part of a letter back to then Governor Scott, very clearly acknowledging what terms of a sentence included. They've now done a 180, and they've brought out the dog whistles and the demagoguery to suggest that this is, you know, some sort of Jim Crow era policy. Here's their problem. Probation is a financial obligation. So the very plain text of Amendment 4, before you even get to the very sensible and logical approach by our Supreme Court this week, before you even get to the interpretation of what all terms of a sentence means, the word probation is in Amendment 4, and that's a financial obligation. And so the ACLU, trying to raise money in memberships, has gone out there and beat the drum that the Florida legislature, led by GOP people, wants to suppress the vote of certain people, and in doing so, they have threatened the very existence of Amendment 4, because if, in fact, any financial obligation prior to the ability to vote for a felon is a violation of the 24th Amendment, then Amendment 4 on its face is a poll tax. So by their definition, they campaigned for, they raised money for, and they asked people to vote for a poll tax. It makes it quite evident that they're not actually in the business of trying to restore or re-engage citizens in democracy. It makes it quite clear that the only thing they're interested in is their own pocketbooks, their membership, and their own relevance.
Representative Grant and other lawmakers in Florida have made a number of criminal justice reforms in recent years, but not in one area. A bill speeding through the state Senate would make some of the first major sentencing reforms in decades. In certain drug trafficking cases, it would allow for judges to depart from mandatory minimum sentences. The idea is facing opposition from some law enforcement and prosecutors, but lawmakers were quick to respond to their opposition.
When you get to the 15 and 25-year level of trafficking, that is a lot of drugs. That is not a personal possession amount.
Many of these people are girlfriends of drug dealers. Many of that get caught up in the whole thing, and they're facing the exact same charge or similar charges the drug dealers facing.
The House has historically been more conservative on criminal justice issues. This bill still has a long way to go. A bill that would mandate parental consent for abortions for girls under 18 has cleared another pivotal hurdle in the state capitol. As Jake Stofan tells us, a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee this week focused heavily on whether the legislation is constitutional.
The state Supreme Court struck down a law in 1989 that required minors to get their parents' consent before having an abortion. Now, more than 30 years later, lawmakers believe they've come up with a new version that can be upheld.
This bill also provides judicial waiver process and a medical emergency exception in accordance with the Florida Supreme Court's decision in In Re TW.
Before clearing its second Senate committee, lawmakers heard from both sides of the debate. Passions were high.
I'm a 62-year-old woman who had an abortion at 16 and have not been able to have a child since.
The implementation of this bill will not lead to stronger families. It will lead to more girls dying of sepsis in the emergency room after attempting to self-administer an abortion.
The bill still needs to clear one more Senate committee before it's ready for a floor vote. The governor, throwing his weight behind the bill during his State of the State address, sends a strong message to senators. Senate sponsor Kelly Sturgill says public opinion is also on her side.
It's not a partisan issue. It's more about having the family have the opportunity to have a discussion with their minor daughter when she's pregnant.
But opponents say the real battle will be in the courts.
This really is the end game, is to open up the privacy clause in Florida's Constitution to expand upon and pass more abortion restrictions.
Opponents worry the state Supreme Court's newly conservative leaning may increase the likelihood the legislation could stand this time around. Reporting from the state capitol, Jake Stofan, 8 on your side.
Holiday fireworks are one step closer to becoming legal twice a year in Florida. A state Senate committee passed the bill earlier this week. Initially, it would have legalized fireworks on Independence Day, New Year's Eve and Day, and Memorial Day. But then the committee removed Memorial Day from the list because of the higher fire risk during Florida's dry season.
The ag commissioner called, and there are some other individuals as well that spoke and said that is the high and typically the high point of the dry season. So Memorial Day coming out would alleviate some of those concerns.
The bill is now ready for a vote on the Senate floor. It still needs to pass one more committee in the House before it goes to a full vote. The 2020 legislative session is underway in Tallahassee. Coming up, we'll break down a big issue legislators are working on. And later, we talk with Tampa's public defender, Julie Holt. She's Hillsborough County's public defender. We'll talk about her future and some news about the alleged Seminole Heights serial killer trial. That's all coming up. Stay here. From pirates on stilts to 30-year-old macaw from Zoo Tampa, Tampa Day took over the state capitol this past Wednesday. Traditional Cuban sandwiches were handed out from a pirate ship, and there were beads galore. The annual event is a chance for the chamber to showcase Tampa. State Representative Jackie Toledo of Tampa says the awareness will help her convince fellow legislators to approve her 35 different budget requests for the Tampa area. The 2020 Florida legislative session started on Tuesday in Tallahassee. For a look at what's been happening in the state capitol this week, let's turn now to our Capitol Bureau Chief, Mike Vasalinda. Good morning to you, Mike. What is the prospect for gun background checks legislation? There seemed to be some movement on a bill that attempted to close the gun show loophole, but didn't really. And now it looks like it might not be going anywhere. What's going on there?
So the legislation that was drafted and voted out of committee earlier this week would require everyone who personally sells a gun at a public location to get a complete form and information and history and identification from the buyer, and that is pretty similar to every form that is used when you purchase a firearm from a licensed firearm dealer. The problem is really the House has no real appetite to do this. I think they're willing to consider it. I think they're willing to take it up and take a vote, perhaps. But the House Speaker very clearly saying we tread very lightly when we're talking about people's constitutional rights. So I think the House is a partial roadblock, at least on the background check legislation. And then there is the governor who says there's no such thing as a gun show loophole. If you no one goes to a fairgrounds or wherever these are held in an auditorium and sets up a table to sell one gun to one individual. These are people that presumably go with 5 or 6 or 10 guns and sell them to individuals that they don't know with no background check. And that's sort of the loophole that they're trying to close.
None of those bills, including the one that you're discussing, does anything about private sales. So the gun show loophole is really kind of misnamed because it doesn't just have to do with gun shows. Mike Vasalinda, our Capitol Bureau Chief, coming to us from Tallahassee this morning. Thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate you being here. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Politics on Your Side. I am joined now by Hillsborough County Public Defender Julie Holt. Good morning to you, Julie.
Good morning. How are you, Evan?
Good, good. Thanks for being here. All right, we'll start out. You've got some news you want to share with us.
Well, I'm running for Public Defender one more time. I'm going to run for re-election. I'm going to open an account next week, and we'll be moving on. Let's
start with the voting rights. Amendment 4 was found by the Florida Supreme Court yesterday to include fines, fees, and restitution as the completion of a sentence for ex-felons. How does that affect what your office is doing?
We were waiting for the Florida Supreme Court opinion. It now says what it says, and obviously we've now have 4 applications that are pending. What we'll be doing is we're filing petitions on behalf of those individuals. Hillsborough County has set a process in place. We're going to work with the clerk's office, with the courts, with the state attorney's office, and we're going to start representing individuals as it relates to this very important right, obviously.
And the petitions do what?
Well, the petitions in this particular 4 instances will be asking for the court to consider either vacating the fines, finding a way to handle the restitution through some type of payment plan or something of that sort. We'll be seeking donations, obviously, through other organizations that are trying to assist in this area.
To help pay those off?
That's correct. But it looks like the first 4 aren't going to involve restitution. They're going to be a little bit cleaner in that sense.
Governor DeSantis said on Twitter that voting is a privilege that shouldn't be taken lightly.
Well, it's certainly a privilege, but it's also a right that we have as United States citizens here in this country. And none of us should take it lightly. And what we should also do is try to restore as many individuals as possible to a position where they can, in fact, have that right to vote. We have federal legislation that's pending. And then the other thing that's very important to remember is our office represents individuals which are financially challenged from day one. And a lot of people don't realize how exorbitant some of these fines and costs are, and how hard it would be for even individuals who have full-time paying jobs making great money, or at least we think we're making great money, to pay those types of fines.
Let's talk about Baker acting for kids. You've got a town hall coming up this week about this issue. Tell us what's happening there.
Well, we represent anyone that's charged with a Baker Act, so let's start from that standpoint. What we've noticed over the last couple of years and what we've been talking through our Safe and Sound Hillsborough Leadership Council is the increasing numbers of children that are being taken from the school system and from the community, and then they're being placed into the Baker Act system. It's a very complicated system. A lot of the parents don't understand how it works. Our town hall that is set for January 23rd next week through Again Safe and Sound Hillsborough is hopefully going to educate more people in the public, more parents, about how this process works. The reason that it's important is because the legislature has mandated that the school system pay very close attention to anyone where there's any type of really behavioral issues that can be tied into the mental health aspect. The situation, however, that exists is that you really have to have a communication and a conversation about the stigma with mental health, because it really is, once you have something put into your file, whether it's a court file or a school file or anything of that sort, that really is kind of like isolating you into another silo in life. And so for us, it's important that we really talk about really mental well-being. How do we recognize the difference between a true illness, a true disorder, and maybe just some type of behavioral issues that are existing that we can really cognitively change in some way.
Let's talk finally now about the case that everyone knows about, Howell Trey Donaldson III,
Yes.
Accused of murdering 4 people in the Seminole Heights killing several years ago. What is the status of the case? You took this case on personally, and you don't often do that. Why?
I think that my experience and my relationship with the court system will lend some credibility to the fact that this case really needs to be addressed in a very logical and a very it's going to be time-consuming case. This is not something
very time-consuming. 50,000 pages of documents, 300 witnesses.
Correct.
The trial's set for August 20th of this year. What is the status in your office? It must be overwhelming for you.
Well, it is overwhelming. Today, my office is taking depositions. We took depositions earlier this week. We're still receiving discovery in this case. And at the last court hearing, you know, I commented to the judge that I don't believe that August date is a realistic date. And it's important for the public, however, to know we are working on that case just as we are in many other cases on a very timely basis. Is there an end in sight for this case? You know, certainly I have laid out in my own mind when I believe that this can be realistically tried. The big part will be, let's take the discovery depositions. There's still 250 of those to do.
When is that? When do you think it can be realistically
I don't believe
tried?
this case can be tried any sooner than 2 years from now, if we're fortunate enough to really work at the pace we're working now.
Would you be seeking to delay it that long?
I don't think the judge is going to let me delay it for 2 years when I appear, but what I am going to do is keep the judge advised of where we are, and we're going to do that through written documents so that the public can look at those also and be aware of the work that we are doing and how much more we have left to do.
Julie Holt, Hillsborough County Public Defender, running for re-election later this year. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evan.
We really appreciate it. We'll be right back. Vice President Mike Pence was in New Tampa this week for a Keep America Great rally on Thursday before holding a Latinos for Trump rally near Orlando. We asked Chuck Todd from Meet the Press about the vice president's campaign strategy and his visit to the Bay Area.
Well, it's been actually very interesting. I've been following the vice president's schedule very closely of late, and he's actually been ramping up a lot more of these swing state visits. During the impeachment debate, as Washington gets into focus, I've noticed that the Trump campaign is deploying Pence to certain battleground states, essentially to do these smaller events. No, they're not going to get national attention, but they want him to get local attention. So he's coming. Obviously, one of the swing media markets is yours there in Tampa, so he's there, but he's also, for instance, in a couple weeks going to Sioux City, Iowa. While the caucuses are going on, he's doing a bus trip there. Iowa's still one of the key battleground states. So it does appear to me this is all part of a strategy here, as you've seen, and certainly Florida being so important to the president's path to 270 electoral votes. Florida is going to be a frequent place they send folks. But the vice president in particular is being deployed a lot more on the campaign trail just as the calendar turned to 2020. And so these are now becoming more regular appearances on campaign-style events. Focusing on Tampa here. As I explained to you in a week, it's Iowa. It's almost like weekly now. Pence in particular has battleground state duty.
Thanks for joining us, folks. Meet the Press with Chuck is next. Our next newscast tonight at 6.